My guest this week is Peaches Christ. The alter ego of Joshua Grinnell, Peaches is a filmmaker, event producer, and cult leader living in San Francisco. She wrote and directed the feature film All About Evil, starring Natasha Lyonne, and produces and hosts events in partnership with Poly Arts Management for symphony orchestras, including her holiday show, which annually plays at London's prestigious Royal Albert Hall. Joshua is also the co-owner of the Into the Dark production company, which produces immersive theater, including the popular Terror Vault show at the historic San Francisco Mint Building. Peaches has also appeared in many films and television shows during her career and co-hosts the cult movie podcast Midnight Mass. And it is my great pleasure to welcome the Revolutions Per Movie, the one, the only, the legend, Peaches Christ. Hi, Peaches.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. Before we get into Depeche Mode 101, the documentary about them playing their 101st show on their tour in 1989, I want to thank you for coming on and being the 50th guest on Revolutions Per Movie. I wanted to time it up that way. It's not 101, but I couldn't wait. So thank you.
I'm completely honored. And I don't know if you know this, but I just turned 50.
Hey, welcome to the club.
Thank you.
It's a pretty full club nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really weird. It's kind of interesting to interview people now and be like, oh, Jerry and Devo is 75 years old. Right.
It's crazy.
Speaking of age, I wanted to talk to you about something from your past and something from your present. There's just so much to talk about with you. I wanted to ask you about the Midnight Mass shows that you did in San Francisco, the live shows, how they came to be, because the people I talked to who got to witness it, I'm so jealous. As a kid who went to midnight movies in Portland, Oregon, it was like, besides Rocky Horror, it was kind of like you went to it and then you got out on the street at 2:15 and went home. There was no excitement. Can you tell the listeners a bit about what you created there?
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of just making it up as I went along. And I think in a lot of ways, my whole career, quote unquote, because I don't even know how to describe it as a career, but my whole sort of interest in doing things has always revolved around kind of what would I want to go to as an attendee. And so
Absolutely.
It was sort of like, as a kid who grew up in Maryland and was obsessed with Divine, and the discovery of John Waters, and then through his book Shock Value, learned a lot about people like William Castle,
Yes.
and Russ Meyer and Ted Michaels. I was obsessed with midnight movies, and of course, shortly after discovering Divine, I discovered Frankenfurter, and went to Rocky Horror screenings in the suburbs of Maryland, Baltimore, and I was a kid who loved horror and anything macabre or weird, was obsessed with haunted houses, worshipped Elvira. So Peaches Christ in many ways was a drag persona that was built out of, I studied improv theater, as weird as that sounds, in high school.
Mm-hmm.
When improv wasn't popular the way it is today. And I got into theater as a kid, when I was really, really young, because I was always outspoken. I never really knew to be ashamed by all the things that made me queer. So I was like kind of an unapologetic sissy who was like, oh, I want to be a star. I was Pearl,
Right.
And I'm lucky enough that I didn't have parents who were totally afraid of that or shamed me. So they put me in children's theater workshops as a kid. I almost went to the Baltimore School for the Performing Arts, but the commute was, when they told me what time I'd have to wake up to get to high school, I was like, no, thanks.
No passion projects worth that at that age.
Right. So I was in Catholic school and, but I was the kid who had parents, and this is very Midnight Mass in many ways, who understood that my obsession with creating my own haunted house had to be done.
Okay.
And so at 12, 13, 14 years old, I was writing and directing these massive shows that we would stage in the woods. I would get permission to do, to do these builds, in the woods. My dad would take the chain off the chainsaw and he would run the finale scene, and my mother would sell tickets and wear the ridiculous costumes I would, put her in or whatever.
So great.
I took it for granted, right? Because
Sure.
that was what I knew as a kid growing up in the 80s. Then later in life, I was really able to go, oh my God, my parents were amazing. I had no idea. Like so many of my peers didn't have that experience.
Right.
So I did improv theater in high school, and I think in many ways, all of that childhood stuff it gave birth to the young adult version of me, which was Peaches Christ. And Midnight Mass was a show that I created to be uniquely my own sort of dream of what a drag show could be. So it was midnight movie screenings coupled with outrageous, insane, basically William Castle style gimmicks,
Totally.
Herschel Gordon Lewis style gimmicks, things that sometimes I would just throw on a poster and not even know how we were going to accomplish it. So things like, oh, it'd be hilarious to offer free lap dances at our showgirl screenings. Okay, the deal is they have to buy a large popcorn, and then we'll provide a free lap dance. Well, then, of course, I figured out how we would do that, and and that morphed and evolved over the years. But that was what Midnight Mass was. It was random, it was outrageous, it was silly, it was dangerous, it was unprofessional, it was,
Right.
but we always delivered a midnight movie screening. And back, I mean, in the first year, you'll appreciate this as a movie person. I didn't have. It was just my friends. I didn't have any sort of budget or any sort of team.
Sure.
So I was the manager of the theater in drag. Well, what I would do is often build up the film print that afternoon, inspect the print.
Right. So these were still film prints. You weren't.
Oh, yeah. This is Midnight Mass was 1998.
Right. So amazing. I mean, how hard was it to find those prints? Some of those are really obscure.
Crazy. Yeah. I mean, and the first movie we ever did was a pain in the ass because I really, really wanted to do Faster Pussycat Kill Kill.
Sure.
And Landmark Theaters, who was the one that they were the company where I was doing the series. They owned the Bridge Theater. I ran the Bridge Theater. And they didn't think this was going to work, but I pestered them enough that they allowed me to quote unquote try it. They would book the movies. So I worked with a film booker down in LA, Mark Vallon. And so often, if it weren't a title that was, with one of the major studio libraries, it could be quite, challenging.
Right.
And Russ Meyer Films was very, very challenging.
Yeah, he owned his own stuff.
Yes. And the only interaction I ever had with Mr. Meyer was him calling me and chewing me out on the phone because he thought I stole one of his Pussycat trailers.
Wow.
And yeah, and that's my one and only, interaction with this idol of mine. I learned later, of course, through friends that he sadly was suffering from dementia and was always paranoid and thought everyone was, sort of stealing from him.
Oh, wow.
And, yeah. So it was sort of like I had this weird run-in that I didn't understand, but then understood it later. But yeah, that was how my cult movie screenings got started, and they morphed and evolved,
That got so big, though. I mean, I was hearing about, like, tell me if this is true. Roller derby experiences during Spider Baby.
Yes, drag queen roller derby.
Okay.
Which we did a lot. We did it for Xanadu, Spider Baby,
Sure.
the Doll Squad.
That's amazing.
There weren't enough roller boogies to do it.
Right.
So I started doing it to random, movies. Like what it has to do with Spider Baby, I have no fucking clue.
I know, that's what I love about it. I love Spider Baby.
Well, you know what it was? I'll be honest. It was that gimmick put butts in seats. And so as a programmer, I could actually screen something that people weren't going to buy tickets for because they didn't know what it was. And so I was really kind of manipulative back then. Like, I want the world to experience Tura Satana and the Doll Squad. I want them to understand that this is where Charlie's Angels came from, or I want them to see Spider Baby, and so I would couple drag queen roller derby because that actually is what would sell the tickets.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And then there's always an element of danger, dislocated body parts, mud wrestling.
Yeah.
Before, Mommy Dearest. And then can you walk me through the event that was CARRIE and just the youthful thought process and the danger of the show you put on when you screened Carrie.
Well, we did Carrie a number of times, and it was always come to the prom, obviously, and then there was always a theme, and most often the theme the year that you're talking about, because there was this sort of scandalous year. The theme was Unplug the Love, and it was like the decorations were, I asked the art folks to do, and the art folks, by the way, were the kids that worked at the theater. Over the years, I went from having disgruntled older artists who did not want a young manager disrupting their sleepy, quiet, single screen art house movie theater to, attracting the punk kids and the artists because of Midnight Mass. So
Right.
Over after the first few years, I had this team who were willing to really go the extra mile, and they were all creative kids, and it was a collaboration. So they would decorate, the auditorium, the lobby, and this theme of Unplug the Love included a giant tampon with Unplug the Love written in blood that was stretched across the set behind me, and then we did like a giant balloon arch of 100 balloons or something, and I was Principal Christ every year that we did the prom at Midnight Mass. I used to do a spring prom at Tranny Shack, which was the underground cabaret nightclub that I performed at, and basically all the performers for Midnight Mass and Tranny Shack were pretty much interchangeable. We were two events, but we were basically sister events, and that was run by my dear late friend Heclina, and I would do Principal Christ every year at a goth prom. The Aleister Crowley School for the Performing Arts presents Black Celebration, which ties into what we're about to discuss, because I would that show would always open with the song Black Celebration, with a Peaches number performed as Principal Christ, and then Principal Christ would reappear in the summer for a Carrie screening. So I often had these characters, that would reappear, and Principal Christ was annoying and bitchy, and I took inspiration from Mary Warnoff and Rock and Roll High School. She was very Togar, and and it ended up lip syncing to Natalie Merchant's, I forget what it's called, but where she's basically repeating, "I want to thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you." And I would put it on a loop, and it would be so annoying that eventually the other cast members in the show would climb up a ladder behind me and dump a bucket of blood on me. And this evening, the auditorium was warm enough that we could sort of justify having the giant metal doors open, and the audience didn't really question why. And not only do we often want to kind of air out the pot smoke that was coming from the audience, but just it was warm in there. Even in San Francisco in the summertime, which is notoriously chilly. And so these metal doors slammed shut, as the auditorium turned red, and the iconic music from the movie started, and Peaches is standing there in her best Carrie pose. And, I had some telekinesis rigged up with some fishing line and different props. But my grand idea to make it even more over the top this year was to have decorated metal pails across the front of the stage that you couldn't tell were metal pails because they had, I don't know, crepe paper on them, probably something totally dangerous that shouldn't have been on them. And they were filled with kerosene soaked rags. And then I had the crew, the staff of the theater, throw lit matches into these pails. And, I created a wall of fire, for me to be surrounded by, which was terrifying because I thought for a moment that I was being shot by a gun. What I realized after a few beats was that it was the heat from the fire causing the balloons to all explode behind me. Between the auditorium doors slamming shut, the fire, and the exploding balloons, I'll say that the audience was rattled. And not necessarily in the best way, This is definitely one of those moments. There were a few moments where later in life, as I matured a little bit, I am so lucky that there weren't cell phones the way that there are now, because people would have been calling 911. I mean, in fact, actually, there was one event where someone did call 911, but that's it. that is a different story altogether. But yeah, this was the sort of spirit of Midnight Mass. It was renegade, it was punk rock, it was wild. And as an older person now, I can also look back and say, it's easy to glorify a lot of this stuff, but I won't, because I'm lucky. I'm really, really
Sure.
lucky, and I realize now, especially someone who runs, a professional haunted attraction where we employ 150 people and it's immersive theater with elaborate gags and special effects. I will say that I have learned my lessons about safety,
Sure.
and I would never condone or support a young person who thinks any of this is a good idea. That's my caveat.
But it was also the era,
Yes.
the type of shows you go to. Joanna went, and I mean, you're in San Francisco. A lot of amazing art and performance and music was just tilted on its side there. And I read something about the spirit of what you did was like, yeah, we never really rehearsed it,
Yeah.
and that when I was talking to David Weissman about the Cockettes film, he said the same thing. He was like, yeah, that was, it's like they were kind of not that interested in the work. It was more of just like, let's get to the show. Let's get to the fun part.
And that was definitely, and the way we started was a seed was planted by Mr. John Waters himself when he came to my my university when I was a student making my senior thesis film Jizz Mopper, and the faculty at Penn State didn't quite see the value in it. I thought, well, here's my chance to show them that you can become a successful filmmaker making bizarre comedies, so I brought him to Penn State as a leader of both the student filmmakers organization and the queer organization, and selfishly, it was just a chance to flaunt him in the face of the faculty that didn't like me, but also, and of course, all of them wanted to like rim his ass when he got there, and wanted photos with him. So total hypocrites,
Right.
Not to say that I am a John Waters. It's just sort of like all of us, especially at film school, we're attaching ourselves to our filmmaking heroes, and that's what young people do, and that's what film is in many ways, is taking what you love and making your own interpretation of something that inspired you. And at that time, I was surrounded by a sea of people who wanted to be Martin Scorsese, like that.
Right.
I was at Penn State, it was straight white guys with a lot of confidence, who are getting to make movies with a lot of, guns.
Right.
Yes. And I mean, they weren't even as cool as Quentin Tarantino. You know what I mean? They didn't have those references. Quentin hadn't quite, he was just about to come out with Pulp Fiction. So, that hadn't really happened yet. So I was just an anomaly, and John coming to the school was important for me, but he is the one who off stage told me about the Cockettes. And that was, oh my God. And then I got to fantasize about the Cockettes and the Kuchar brothers, and, the TV show Tales of the City, the Armistead Maupin show came out, and San Francisco felt like Oz to me. And it just made it feel like a destination, like a place I had to get to. And it was, and I made this midnight movie thing inspired by the Cockettes, and then later the Cockettes told me that it was nothing like what they did. And I think they meant that as both a compliment and an insult,
Sure, yeah.
And in many ways it couldn't have been what they did. They did it in 1969. I was doing my show in the late 90s, and the other thing is, theirs existed in such a small amount of time. I think a lot of people don't realize that the Cockettes only did those shows at the Palace Theater for 2 years. That whole thing was so, when you think about it, it was so short-lived. And we were lucky enough, I think, to be around long enough that we did end up evolving into a place where we rehearsed, and the shows changed and evolved, and we would get bored with not rehearsing. Part of the excitement was to challenge ourselves to, one day I remember showing up with a script, and it was like all hell broke loose because people couldn't imagine actually having to learn lines. That was the level that we were dealing with, but it evolved, and scripts at some point became more normal. Live music became more normal, making props, so it was a real evolution for us.
Well, and now you get to work with one of my heroes, Mink Stole, from the John Waters players,
Yes.
and again, if I was working with Mink Stole, it would take me a while to calm down every time I was in her presence. What is it like working with her on, you have a tour coming up, and I'll put the dates in the show notes. What is that like for you from, somebody who had such an influence on who you are?
It was surreal. I mean, I think meeting people like John, which was the first idol I'd ever met, and I was in college. I remember it being like a cartoon, like when his little tiny plane was landing in State College. We had this little tiny airport, and realizing that my knees were actually shaking, like a cartoon, like my knees. And I thought, oh my God, this is a real thing. And same thing with Mink. The night before I was to meet Cassandra Elvira, I could not sleep. So I was meeting her on like 20 minutes of sleep,
Right.
Mink was someone whose lines of dialogue I had memorized. And not only did I memorize them, all of my friends memorized them.
Of
We would
course.
say all those Connie Marble and Peggy Gravel, Taffy Davenport lines to each other repeatedly. It was like a code. It was our gay language. And not just for homosexuals, but for queer people, weirdos who understood, this is the world that we wanted to live in. We wanted to live in the John Waters universe. So when she agreed to come up and do Midnight Mass, not only was I shocked because, as you can imagine, none of these people I'm mentioning, none of them were ever paid what their actual fee would have been. So they all
Hmm.
did it because they were supporting this weirdo
Right.
drag queen, this midnight movie scene. But yeah, Mink was the first. And, I didn't know it at the time, but I effectively impressed her. I found out later because I, built this giant shrine to her on stage. And, it was an idol worship show back in the year 2000. We had a banner that said Hail Mink, and I geared up San Francisco for this arrival. And when she was introduced and she came down the aisle and hit that stage, that San Francisco audience got on their feet and applauded, and they didn't stop, and you could tell that she
Incredible.
was genuinely moved by it.
Yeah.
And she told me later, and actually we talk about this in the show, that the never-ending tour of idol worship shows that we do, because we do them in chunks. So it's been going
Sure.
on for years. Um, she will talk about how um, it was tough for her to be in big shadows. And she struggled with being in both the shadow of Divine and the shadow of John. And she understood why those shadows existed. And she never wanted to take away from their light. But she did feel like she would often get lost. And if she was to be honored or to receive a tribute, it was her with Divine and John, or her with
Sure.
Edie and Liz Renee, or whatever. Um, and so this was the first time that she'd been given her own, real pedestal. And I feel so honored that I was able to do that. And then we've never stopped, for all these years. And one way or another, I've been contributing to creating tributes to her. Luckily, others have kind of come along and seen this value and booked her for other things. And now they really, really get their proper acknowledgement, as the Academy Museum has, done this gorgeous exhibit for them. So it's changed, but at that time, she had not experienced that.
Well, what is your favorite Mink Stole line?
Oh, I mean, it's so cliched, but every time I hear it, I just think there are two kinds of people in this world, Miss Sandstone, Miss Sandy Sandstone, my kind of people, and assholes. I'm afraid it's rather obvious which category you fit into. Have a nice day. I mean,
Just
it's
what a read.
what a read. John, that writing, that dialogue, and she'll talk in our show about you did not deviate. They had to read it
Yes.
word for word for word. But as you can imagine, there weren't many people in Baltimore at this time who could do what Divine did, who could do what Mink did, or who could even do what Edith Massey did. You can't perform that. You either are it or you're not. With Mink and Divine, they were fucking actors. They were actors. And then they were supported by really talented people like David Lockery and Mary Vivian Pierce. But I really
Absolutely.
look at like Mink and Divine are like stars, like superstars. And the way they would deliver that dialogue, the other, of course, I wouldn't suck your lousy dick if I was suffocating and there's oxygen in your balls. I mean,
The inflection of the words is also
genius.
it's perfect.
Yeah.
It's like, and only somebody who knows how to read John's, writing would, they were sharing the same psychic DNA, it's incredible.
Sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
Yeah. So it was brilliant.
Well, I can't wait to see the show. And again, like I said, I'll put the links in the show notes, and then you can sit next to me at the Clinton Street Theater, across from where my video store used to be.
Amazing. And I bet you had all those Mink Stole movies at your video store.
I had all that stuff. I had TV Michael's section. I had all that stuff.
Amazing.
It was opening the store. It was almost easier to find that stuff on VHS I came in right when all the little indie stores were kind of going out of business in 96, and they were struggling, competing with Blockbuster and Hollywood that would come into the neighborhood. And so I would go to these stores, and they'd been around, 15 years. They were over it. And they'd just be like, here you go. They would just gift me stuff like, this is garbage. There was nowhere to sell it. There was no eBay. There was no collecting culture kind of. And so it was funny to be like, well, I can get like you said, the Doll Squad pretty easily.
Amazing.
But like these other films are harder to get that actually had an actual release, in 1978 by a big studio, but it's just been out of print on VHS forever. So, but let's get into the Depeche Mode film. I'm really excited to talk to you about it because, the film was made by D.A. Pennebaker and Chris Hegedus, who collectively, did some of the greatest films, Don't Look Back, Ziggy Stardust, Spiders from Mars, The War Room, Monterey Pop, original cast album, Company. And it ended up that this film was D.A.'s favorite film he ever made, which is incredible when you think about he's filmed Bowie, he's filmed Dylan, all the bands in Monterey Pop, Sondheim, and it's just like, no. And the reason he loved it was he didn't know much about the band when he was hired, and he really wasn't a fan when he started filming them. He said, the music all sounds the same. And then in the end, he just was won over by just the band themselves and the audience. He just fell in love with it. And it's a really weird film in terms of how it's structured. When did you first come across this film?
I mean, it had to have been its VHS release because I have no memory of it playing theatrically where I was, so I don't think it did. I mean, maybe it played in DC or something. I don't know, but I was like any young person, but especially if you grow up feeling like an outsider or different than your peers. I was so attached to my movie taste and my music taste as part of my identity, and it was so incredibly crucial to me at that age. I was in 1989 I was 15 years old, so I mean like that is the age, right? And I had been into Depeche Mode since they had their big hit in the States, People Are People, which really was not anything other than a way to draw me in and to buy their albums, and then realized, especially with Black Celebration and Music for the Masses, oh, this is what it means to be alternative. And part of my identity, loving Depeche Mode and The Cure and Susie and the Banshees, New Order, and even, all the gay stuff that I loved unapologetically, the Pet Shop Boys, liking Madonna at a certain point was transgressive, believe it or not, because
I remember.
What she came to stand for.
It was like a club thing.
Totally. And and the fact that woman was another part of liking all this stuff was that there was a lot of queerness being put out there. Even Depeche Mode, who were a bunch of straight guys, were in their own way, Martin Gore wearing a skirt and wearing eyeliner, like in their own way, we're very much standing up for queer people. And I saw 101 on VHS probably the moment I could get my hands on it. And we were lucky in Annapolis because we got a Tower Records and Video right around this time. And
Hmm.
that was a fucking lifesaver, you know?
Yeah, you had the import section even.
Oh my God. And so I bought a VHS copy of 101. I would have screenings, I would have parties, I would bring my friends over. I would kind of convert people to the
Yes.
religion that is Depeche Mode. And oh God, it's just to me, it's still a perfect movie in many, many ways. And rewatching it, getting ready for your podcast was a reminder of why I loved it. Like it does not, you know how some things you rewatch over time, and having my own, you know, podcast where we rewatch movies that I haven't seen in 40 years, 30
Sure.
years, whatever. Sometimes I'm like, oh, okay. Well, yeah, I guess I liked this as a kid, but I don't know. Or it's real cringy or whatever. No, no. Watching 101 again, it was like, oh my God, I fucking love them. You know, I felt the fandom.
It's such a sweet moment in time for them too, because they are really kind of growing up in America. They're still really young. Audiences have found them now. A lot of the film is them backstage, their managers dealing with stuff, interviews being cut in half, you know, and songs being cut in half. That I think of some people when they first saw the film, the initial reaction is like, what is this? Where are the songs? I want to see a complete live song. I've never got to see them. But the brilliance in it is that they show what it was actually like the boredom, the excitement, the nerves, um, and also the through line of having this competition with these kids in New York who are then going to be whittled down to 10 kids who get on a bus in New York and are traveling across the US to see Depeche Mode in California at the Rose Bowl is really unique at the time, a total precursor to all the MTV stuff that was going to happen later on.
Yeah, like the real world didn't exist. And this was the real world on a bus.
Right.
But on a concert bus, because that's what one thing that's really interesting about it is they do show the band interacting with them at one point where Alan and Andrew come on the bus. It's a great sequence, but in general it felt like, and I don't know, I mean it'd be interesting to know more, and I know that you've seen more of the behind the scenes stuff than I have,
Hmm.
which I'm excited to go and check out now because you've turned me on to it. But I feel like, just as someone who watched the movie a lot, that the kids were on that bus and that bus was independent of the other tour in some ways because they're often getting lost. So clearly they
Yes.
weren't, you know, they weren't part of the tour machine, right? Like a tour bus wouldn't normally get lost from another tour bus because they would be traveling together, you know, that just wouldn't
Right.
happen. So clearly this bus was on its own trajectory, and then occasionally the kids would be invited to, and they were all kids, there wasn't anyone that was very old, you know.
Mm-mm.
um they would be invited to a sound check. You would see them in random smaller auditoriums, you know. But in general it felt like they were pretty independent from what the band was doing, and
Yes.
in that way it created a real world dynamic because they had to live together.
And they were so respectful to the band too. They're
Totally.
not like being like, when can we spend more time with them? When can I get this signed? Can I get a photo with them? They are just excited to be with each other on this bus, dancing, arguing about is fashion art or not. Like the conversations they have are so full of just those things where you could talk into the night, right? About things that you're just so passionate about.
And I love that you bring up the is fashion art moment because it's such a young person's conversation. Like there's such a,
Yes.
especially an alternative young person's conversation. And you know, watching them and looking at them now, there was this sort of this freedom of expression that existed in that era of the late 80s, which we think of as being so conservative and so closety, and in many ways it was, right? But our pop stars were people like Prince and Annie Lennox and Boy George, and you know, and we loved bands like Depeche Mode. And so, you know, those sequences that really hit me the most over the head were where they're interacting with people in the South, and they're going into liquor stores. And as a queer person living in the world of MAGA today, it made me nervous for them. But I'm realizing, oh, it was a different era. They didn't have to worry that they were going to get shot because they walked into a store with a mohawk. I think you'd be genuinely scared, today to appear that queer. And by queer, I just mean odd, other, alien to those folks. And the people, they had like sort of a playfulness with the young people. They were
they want to touch their hair.
Yeah, they were
like, can I feel your hair?
Yeah, and I love the scene, with the Latin Guns N' Roses fans.
Yes.
I just don't know that playfulness between the two tribes would exist. In fact, it's actually the Depeche Mode fans that come off as a little cunty. It's like,
Yes.
they're calling them guns and posers, and
Being
and
judgmental.
kind of being, kind of judgmental.
Superior.
But to be fair, I really, really liked it when Chris, brought, I forget her name, the beautiful blonde woman, and says she's a beautiful woman and she is to be respected, because they were getting a bunch of that machismo, sort of sexist energy directed towards her. It's a great time capsule of that era, and there was sort of a sweet innocence to it, that just doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, it's again, and if this was made now, completely different film.
Yeah.
They would be tied to the hip with the band, probably. They would be traveling in tandem. And the fact that basically this was kind of an afterthought while they were making the film. Depeche Mode's main point was they just didn't want it to be a concert film. They had a lot of pressure putting on this Rose Bowl show because it was over 60,000 people. They didn't think they could fill it. Even in the film, they're like, can we move the stage closer to the audience? Like, it doesn't seem like tickets are selling. And, they wanted to take the pressure off them being the focus of the film. And I can't think of many bands at the height of like where they're just starting to just really become a world band, making a choice like that. I think is just brilliant.
Yeah, I think in many ways, if it were made today, you couldn't. It would be very rare for a project like this to exist without the producer's hands being felt all over it. And this feels more like it's made in the spirit of. Well, I mean, he was making other movies the same way. The Maisel brothers were making movies, like this,
Totally.
and now we're just so it's so gross, like none of it's real. It's rare to get these sorts of documentaries, and like you say, if you cast a bunch of kids, even if the producer's intentions were to be completely hands off, all of these kids would have grown up with reality TV. So it's like you watch the difference between early Drag Race versus Drag Race now. Every contestant on Drag Race now is getting on there and trying to figure out what catchphrase is going to sell her the most t-shirts, and they're self-producing. The subjects are self-producing, right? And even the band would have a better idea of what it means to be on camera. So you're right. There's a purity to it that it couldn't, no matter how hard you'd try, you couldn't do this today. It just couldn't be done.
No. And the footage is incredible of the band. David Gahan, incredible performer. You're talking about somebody who is devouring Freddie Mercury and Bowie and, all these British, icons.
Jagger.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But is backed by a wall of people playing keyboards instead of guitar. It's a rock band with synthesizers, and he treats it like a rock show. He poses, he lifts the microphone in the air and holds it majestically. He spins in circles endlessly with his eyes closed. Again, I love any singer that sings with their eyes closed and is in their head. I just have a soft spot for it. And I also have a soft spot for seeing nerds as rock icons. People who you like, these are four of the most unlikeliest rock heroes. And they're like rock gods, and I love it.
And they're both, right? Like they don't compromise. There's not really, it's like like Martin Gore is so awkward in so many ways, and so sweet and so gentle. And you just want to protect him and you don't even know why, it's like, wait, you're like one of the most successful songwriters and you're this god to these thousands of alt fans who worship you, but there's this purity to him still to this day. I think he's managed to you know have that. And one of my favorite moments in the movie actually is they catch like you say, everything's been built up around this Rose Bowl show. And part of the brilliance of the film is that it's all they basically it's like it's almost like a porn film almost. It's like we're gonna tease and tease and tease with these we're gonna edge you, we're gonna give you a little taste of a concert performance here, but we're gonna cut away before we give you the full money shot. And so by the end, when you get to the extended moments on stage at the Rose Bowl, which are so glorious and so great,
Yeah.
right before they have a moment, and you realize if you rewatch the movie, there's a curtain that the when Pimp starts, that they say start the tape or whatever they say.
The tape.
Yeah. There's the track. Pimp is playing the piano music, and then before this sheer curtain comes down, the band is silhouetted behind the curtain as Behind the Wheel starts, and they're playing, but they're still behind the curtain. And then the curtain drops at a certain point and the spotlight hits Dave. And before the curtain drops, there's a moment where Dave and Martin are really catching each other's eyes and smiling at each other repeatedly, right?
Yes.
They're looking back and they're waiting for that curtain to drop, and they know it's about to drop and 60,000 people are about to see them. That moment in a concert movie, I mean, he must have known when he captured that moment. You can tell it is not for the cameras. It is two friends who met when they were teenagers, who've been doing this thing, and they've reached this place. And we get to see that moment between two friends. It's just pure joy,
Again, I think it's the magic of having somebody like DA and Chris on the film, or like you mentioned, the Maisel, where they just have an instinct of where to be at a certain time. And they just capture these things that you're just like, how this is otherworldly. Like the scene where I've never seen a scene like it with an audience, where it's just something about the light and the way they capture it and the way the audience is moving in unison.
Was that the Never Let Me Down Again arms moving back and forth? Yeah. Which they do at any show, which, it's fun to see it in 101 because, of course, that was the concert for the masses when that single was new. But to this day, if you go to a Depeche Mode show, and I've been to many, many, many of them, that is something Dave will always lead the audience in, and it never gets tiring. Although as old people, I think our arms are more tired than they used to be.
Well, and I've seen things like this at concerts before. I've seen interactive, like, let's all do this thing together. But there's something about the way it's shot, and it slowly pans over these 60,000 people, and it just goes on and on and on. And at a certain point, you're like, am I even looking at people anymore?
Yeah.
Like, what is it? It's so abstract and beautiful, the way the light is and the grain of the film.
And it's like that sheer cult energy of, we fucking love them so much, and we love this song, and this music is giving. I mean, it looks religious because it's sort of like a group of people in unison, just in pure celebration, captured on that film. The other thing about this movie that hit me more this time, that didn't maybe because I've had a bigger career now, as an actual event producer, and can watch the film through a different set of eyes than I did as a young person. I'm really impressed by their ability to take moments that you wouldn't think to film and actually have the audacity to put them in the movie, and they work. So the accountants, talking about that being ripped off by the silver t-shirts, right? Like, that's a great moment.
Oh my God, it's amazing. Them pouring boxes of money, like cardboard boxes,
cash,
and you're like,
actual cash. We would never, wouldn't exist today.
It was like, that would be so pocketed now to just be like, all right, one for me, one for them, one for. It's like no accountability, seat of the pants.
Yeah, the other there are a couple other that I just wanted to highlight because I think they're so special. The woman that's doing the lighting cues and the way that she is playing those lights like one of the keyboard players. She might as well be Alan Wilder, because she is dancing with her fingers like it's a piano while also calling all the cues.
Yes.
And I will say, like, to have a woman in that position on the crew at that time is extraordinary, because this was a man's world, this sort of crew life, and her being the lighting designer who's actually calling the cues. I mean, sadly, even to this today in the world of film and tech and production, that still there is not an equitable amount of women doing those roles. So that was really cool. I love the moment where they have the sort of, I don't know what she would be, but like an operations person explaining to the people about the different badges, and in unison they're going,
Yes.
"This means nothing." and she goes, but an alternative at the end is to say, "But it looks wonderful with your outfit this evening," because that was the era of kids creating fake backstage passes or thinking the pass that they had could get them to the band.
Sure.
And I love all that. And now we have it. I mean, that was what concert producing was like in the 80s. That's what concert going was like in the 80s. There are a few, and because of the kids on the bus and the fans being part of the film, we really get to see the importance of fashion and looks and identity. I love this movie. I could go on and on about it. In fact, I am.
Well, yeah, me too. I also think one of the things, we talked about it briefly before, is just even in the alternative music movement or independent music movement or college rock movement, like, you drew lines in the sand. You're like, synthesizers, that's not real music. That's that. And then other people over there are like, well, that's just guitar slob stuff. And it was really weird how, like, partitioned those scenes were in a way that it's not that way anymore.
Yeah.
Like, you can just like anything and not be like, well, I'm a goth or I'm a punker or I'm a metal.
This was the movie that I showed to my punk friends or metal friends. I grew up with, I used to have, butt rock friends, the people I made the haunted houses with, as a teenager were all Metallica fans. And, and I liked Metallica. I grew up loving Metallica, but like, this was the movie that I used to show people that this was valid and fabulous, and I was able to convert people, because I think that it's very hard to watch this movie and unless you're dead inside and not say, I want to go see that band in concert. I want to see it. My parents, annoyingly enough, would watch these things with me, and then they would become fans. And let me tell you, that was irritating, because you didn't want your parents liking your music. I remember finally I would blast music knowing, I remember when A Mind Is a Terrible Thing to Taste came out by Ministry, and I would just blast it so that they finally,
You're like, I got you.
Yeah. They would be like, yeah, we don't like that shit,
I had the same thing. My parents took me to see Devo.
Amazing.
They would go see shows, like if Snakefinger or MX80 Sound were playing and it was an over 21 show, they would go and tell us as their children who were music fanatics. Very sweet. Didn't think of it at the time because there were still parents who grounded me and were tough on me, and like, they were parents. They weren't art parents, but they were supportive. And then you realize, like, oh shit, like, my parents took me to Devo, because
it's cool.
I was 11, and so but I remember that thing also, trying to find the thing that would be like, okay, they aren't gonna go see REM separately from me, and I know they're in the balcony and I'm down here. What is the thing? And,
what was your thing?
I feel like around like the Butthole Surfers, the more transgressive, scraping fetus off the wheel, that kind of more just disruptive, like mid 80s, some of the Wax Trax stuff.
Brilliant. Yeah. They didn't like the Wax Trax stuff. And the first, when Pretty Hate Machine came out, I remember buying a Nin sticker, which was just the logo, and sticking it on the back of my mother's new Volvo station wagon. And her not knowing what it was.
That's awesome.
And like that at that time, people don't get that, like, Nine Inch Nails at that time was very, very alt, so people would be like honking and giving her thumbs up, and
I know, isn't it amazing? Just like, this little band that no one knows of. Oh my God. And then you get to see people that you're like, oh, they like them now. Oh, they've been so mean to me about music my whole
Yeah,
life.
that I mean
They're like,
that was definitely my experience with Depeche Mode. Yeah, the one thing that was sort of a regret that I have is that I didn't get to go to the concert for the masses, and I got to experience it on
right.
101. And by the time I got to go see them, they had already reached their crossover into mainstream success. Now the concerts were still very alternative, and those of us that slept at the mall, waiting for that Ticketmaster ticket outlet, whatever it was, to open up at the
Totally.
Macy's, we were the alt kids for sure. But it was this weird thing where the jocks and the Heathers, liked, the song Enjoy the Silence or whatever. And it was kind of like, well, fuck you, like this doesn't get to be yours. But it wasn't just Depeche Mode, it was everything I liked. I was obsessed with Sinead
Right.
O'Connor's first album. And then, her second album, she became, a top 40 superstar with Nothing Compares to You. And Red Hot Chili Peppers and REM and U2. And I mean, the list goes on and on. Like, we forget that a lot of those huge bands from that era were actually started off as really alt college radio bands with a very small following.
Oh, yeah. I mean, in my interview with Peter, it was like they never came to the Northwest. REM were like, their management was like, there's nothing up there.
That's
Don't go. And it took
insane.
them forever to get up here. And now it's like Portland, Seattle are like total
Yes,
meccas,
that would be
right?
like I would associate. I mean, you would think of REM as being come from there rather than Georgia.
I know it's just wild. So, you just grabbed
Yeah,
what you could. But I feel like there hasn't been a documentary or at least a book made about the stories of people waiting in line to get those
yeah,
tickets. I feel like that was such a wild thing to do, and the weirdest stuff happened. And then you just were like, I think I'm going to get a ticket. I don't know. It's all random. It's like this archaic computer talking to other jean
yeah,
stores. I'm at a jean store in a mall waiting for it to open to
yeah.
buy something at a jean machine. What a weird time.
What young people do not get it, and I try to explain it to them, and it's baffling because it didn't really make sense even then.
No, not at all. It's just like, why is this? This does nothing to do with music. Why did they decide to put it here? Oh, it's just
I'm sure
amazing.
yeah, I'm sure there was some sort of corporate ownership of all of that shit. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
some bullshit reason or another. And unfortunately, that monster has grown to become so ugly and so huge. I
right.
will give credit to my hero Robert Smith for taking them to task last year and forcing them to refund their ridiculous fees. It's
Amazing.
still I still feel like, oh God, these people that I've loved for 40 years are still rad. They're still, amazing. I mean, seeing Dave and Martin tour solo, I mean, not solo, they were together, but the two of them was both
Right.
sad but also amazing because, I of course went to the show, the Memento Mori tour, which was gorgeous and amazing. But when Alan left, that really shifted the band. And of course, amongst all of us
Sure.
hardcore fans, the purest form of Depeche Mode is the four that you see in the movie 101. Alan, of course, left. It not really, it wasn't a congenial way, which was unfortunate. Admittedly, Dave was struggling and had been an asshole and was a heroin abuser. And if you've ever been friends with a drug addict, it's tough, right? So that's how Alan leaves, and then Andrew just up and dies, during the
Yeah.
pandemic and unexpectedly. That being said, those two still deliver the magic. Like, I was skeptical, as a longtime fan. I didn't know how I would feel going to see a concert with Martin and Dave. Of course they have other musicians up there with them, but not only does Dave still deliver that magic that we discussed,
Right.
Martin's music and the way that they put on the show is still just so incredible and so impressive and sort of just so pure and simple. So if you haven't seen them and you get the chance, I would say just buy yourself that ticket. It's worth it.
Yeah, you got to go see your
Yeah.
heroes and icons and people. You just have to. Otherwise there's just too much regret.
And you know, we all have those shows that we didn't see, right? Like I remember being
Yes.
young and someone inviting me to see Nina Simone when I first moved to San Francisco,
Oh my
and me
God.
not going, you know, like, and she was
Yeah.
gone, you know, a year later or something, you know, like just crazy stuff. You know, I did, you know, then I also, then there's the shows where you're like, oh my God, I got to see Tina Turner, you know, or I got to see this person or that person, and other people didn't. So if you, especially when it's an older person and you haven't seen them and you're a big fan, I think that's worth the money, you know.
Yeah, when you find out that James Brown is playing a Chinese restaurant in Portland, Oregon, you go.
What?
You don't go like, why is James Brown playing a Chinese restaurant? You do it. So,
Amazing. I mean, one of the things that for me was so important, you know, that I'm able to look back at and realize was profound about my love for Depeche Mode was their unapologetic um individuality that was associated with queerness. So you've got four straight guys who didn't mind appearing to be queer, wearing black leather and studded belts and big black boots. And at the time, I didn't know that this stuff was considered queer. You know,
right.
I wouldn't. You know, now I look at those Rob Halford images, you know, from Judas Priest and go, wait, how did they not know? But guess what, kids, we didn't know. And the people that did know were like the homophobes, right? They were the ones who kind of
Right.
knew. And there was this great article when they were rehearsing for the World Violation tour. So Violator either was about to come out or it had come out, and Rolling Stone gave them a big cover story. And I'll never forget as a young person reading that and being so obsessed with it because the writer talked candidly about how Depeche Mode was openly called the F word slur, you know, walking down the street, you know, and the writer asked them like, hey, you know, as straight guys, does it bother you that they're calling you, you know, fags and queer and stuff? And I don't remember which one said it. I think it was Dave who said, not at all. Like, why would that bother us? You know, many of our fans happen to be part of this community, and we've you know, we've taken a lot from this culture, and I forget how he articulated it, but it was so cool to have a straight male hero respond the way that he did at that time. And you know, at the end of the day, Martin's sexuality is straight on its surface, but very perverted, and he's been openly a pervert, you know.
Yes, he talks about the S&M clubs and everything they used to do. And
Absolutely.
all the
And it, you
I don't
know,
know if you knew, but they were all like Christian kids, like Christian
I didn't
teenagers.
know that,
And
but it makes sense, you know, with looking
yeah,
at the
so like
lyrics.
even things like,
Blasphemous rumors.
yeah, I think it was, yeah, I think, but there was, they would go to church and they would read a list of people that you would say prayers for.
Oh,
And
right.
Martin was like, we started realizing that the people at the top of the list kept dying no matter how many times we were praying for them, and they were just like, let's get out of here. But they several of them knew each other from church, which is wild. But I love that they're so upfront. um they're honest in their interviews, even in this film. They just, that sequence where Dave talks about like, I could kill someone probably, he's just being honest. He's like,
Yeah, yeah,
I've
yeah.
done it. I've wanted to kill someone. And
That whole interview, I mean, that's the other thing about the movie that I love that's worth touching on is they really show you the grueling grind of this
totally.
band having to do interview after interview after interview. And even as a viewer, you sort of enjoy taking a breath with them if they're playing with a baby or they're playing a pinball machine or they're just getting to hang out with each other, because Pennebaker does a really good job of showing you here they are in another interview, here they are in another photo shoot, here they are, and the band is doing their job, but even you as a viewer go like, oh, shut up, you know, as far as the interviewers. Yeah, yeah, it's really well done.
The scene where Dave has to go, we're actually
Yeah.
all individuals. It's just amazing. It's like just
Or
the
when they
weirdest
that they say,
questions.
okay, now we want you to say, hi, we're Depeche Mode, and the band immediately goes, like, you totally understand where they're coming
They're like,
from. And
no.
we've all seen those spots on MTV or wherever where it's like, hi, we're Motley
Yeah.
Crue, you know, and you're listening to, you know, the Headbangers Ball or whatever, you know. I this movie is just perfection. It's so good.
Well, that leads into the final question of the show. Every show I ask the same question, but I tailor it depending on what we're talking about. So on a scale from 1 to 30, with 1 being the lowest and 30 being the highest, how many Dave Gahan spins in place with his eyes closed do you give this film? On a scale of 1 spin of Dave Gahan to 30 eyes closed spinning Dave Gahan.
Well, I mean, if you ask a question like that, I think, considering the awards system you've put in play and the film that we're discussing, it has to be 30 spins.
Yes, indeed. That is the right answer. I have it written down here. It is 30 spins.
I'm glad I got it right.
Yes, exactly. Peaches, thank you so much for being on here and sharing your love of this film and band with me. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Revolutions Per Movie. We release new episodes every Thursday on your favorite podcast app and additional bonus episodes every Sunday on our Patreon. The show is a completely independent affair, so the best way to support the show is through our Patreon at patreon.com/revolutionspermovie, where you can get weekly bonus episodes and shows, exclusive limited edition flexi discs and records and CDs featuring guests that have appeared on the show, and other exclusive goods sent to you just for joining. You can follow us on social media at Revolutions Per Movie and also find out more information about our various guests in the episode show notes. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week. Bye.